The Sacred Garden by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Longman Classics, Pearson. Chapter 1. There is no one left. Mary Lennox was born in India. Her mother and father were from England, but they lived in India because her father worked there. Mary's mother was very beautiful. She had many friends and she liked to go out with them. She was always with her friends. She had not really wanted a child at all. Mary's father was often out too because he worked very hard. So Mary didn't see her mother or father very often. Servants took care of her. They did everything to please her and to stop her crying. Mary was a thin, ugly baby who was often ill. She did not get better as she grew bigger. She was always a thin, unhealthy child because the servants always did what she wanted. She was not at all a nice child. She thought only about herself. No one loved Mary, and Mary loved no one. One very hot morning, when Mary was 9 years old, a new servant came to wake her. Mary was cross because she wanted the servant whom she knew, not a new one. The woman looked frightened, but Mary's own servant did not come. Later, Mary was left alone. It was a strange morning. No one told her what to do, so she went into the garden to play. She played with flowers and made a little garden of her own. She was cross because she did not know why she was alone. Something was not right. Later, she heard her mother talking, and then she knew what was not right. Many people in the house were ill, and some had died. No one thought about Mary. No one wanted her, and she was sad. She was frightened too. She went to her room. She carried, and then she slept for a long time. When she woke up, the house was very quiet. Perhaps the sickness has gone, she thought. Perhaps everyone is better. Now someone will come and look for me. But no one came. She waited, but the house was still very quiet. Suddenly she heard footsteps outside her room, and two men came in. Bunny, the first man, cried, "There's a child in here, a child alone, in a place like this. Who is she?" "I'm Mary Lennox," the little girl said crossly. "I went to sleep when everyone was ill, and I have just woken up. Why does no one come?" "Why didn't they remember me?" "Poor little girl," said the man called Barney. "There is no one left who could remember you." And so Mary learned that her father and mother were dead. The servants had all run away, and no one thought about the little girl who was left alone in the house. She was not a nice child, and no one cared about her. Chapter 2. Mary goes to England. Mary had no family in India, so she went home to England to live with her uncle, Mr. R.K.B. Craven. Mary had never been to England, and she knew something about her uncle, who was her mother's brother. She was told that he lived in a big old house in the country, and that he was a hunchback. This frightened Mary. She thought too about Yorkshire, and the place where she was going to live. She knew only that it was called Misweight Manor, and that Yorkshire was in the north of England. One of Mr. Carvin's servants, Mrs. Medlock, met Mary in London. She was a fat woman with a red face and little black eyes. Mary did not like her at all, and Mrs. Medlock did not seem to be like Mary very much. During the journey to Yorkshire by train, Mary sat silently and looked out of the window. She had nothing to read, and she looked ugly and cross. Her black dress made her look colourless and ill. Since her mother and father's death, she had begun to think strange thoughts. She had begun to wonder why she always felt so alone. Other children seemed to be part of a family with their mothers and fathers, but even when her mother and father were alive, she had never seemed to be part of a family. She had had food and clothes and servants to take care of her, but no one had really loved her. She did not know that this was because she was not a nice child. She did not know that she was not nice. Mrs. Medlock had never seen a child who sat so still and did nothing. Mrs. Medlock did not like sitting quietly, so at last she said to Mary, "Do you know your uncle?" "No," answered Mary. "Didn't your father and mother talk about him?" "No," said Mary again. Her father and mother had never talked to her about anything. "Oh," said Mrs. Medlock, and she was silent. Then she began again. "Do you know that you are going to a very strange place?" she asked. Mary did not answer, and Mrs. Medlock was surprised because the child was not interested in where she was going to live. "The house is 600 years old, and it's near the town," she went on. "There are 100 rooms, but most of them are shut up and are not used. There are big gardens round the house and trees, and she stopped, and then she said, "But there's nothing more." Mary was always interested in new things, but she did not want people to know that she was interested, so she sat still. "Well," said Mrs. Medlock, "what do you think of it?" "Nothing," Mary answered. This made Mrs. Medlock laugh. "Eh," she said, "you're like a little old woman. Don't you care?" "It isn't important whether I care or not," said Mary. "You're right," said Mrs. Medlock. "It isn't important. I don't know why you're coming to Miswell Manor, but I'm sure that Mr. Carvin isn't going to take any notice of you. He never takes any notice of anyone. He is a strange man, and he is hunchback. He was never happy until he was married." Mary looked at Mrs. Medlock carefully. She was surprised to think of a hunchback being married. Mrs. Medlock was pleased that at last the child seemed to be interested in something. "His wife was a sweet, pretty woman," she said. "He loved her more than anything in the world. When she died—" "Oh, did she die?" Mary asked. Suddenly she felt sorry for Mr. Carvin. "Yes, she died," Mrs. Medlock answered. "And now he is as strange as ever. He is away most of the time, and when he is at Misselthwaite Manor, he stays in one part of the house and only his servant sees him." It sounded like a story from a book, and it made Mary feel sad. A house with 100 rooms near a moor. and Mary did not know what a moor was. A man who was hunchback and who did not like people. Chapter 3. Across the Moor. Mary slept for a long time. It was dark when she woke up. "Wake up!" cried Mrs. Medlock. "This is where we get out. Quickly! We have still got a long drive to the manor." It was still raining. Mary was wide awake now. She wanted to see the strange place which Mrs. Medlock had told her about. "What is a moor?" she asked suddenly. "Look out of the window in 10 minutes' time and you'll see it," Mrs. Medlock answered. "We have to drive 5 miles across the moor, but you won't see much because it's a dark night." Mary did not ask any more questions. She sat and looked out of the window. First, they drove through a small town and then they were out the open country where there were only trees and fields. Then the horses began to climb up the hill. There were no trees or fields now. Mary could see very little in the darkness. "We are on the moor now," said Mrs. Medlock. The wind made a strange, low sound. It's not the sea, is it?" asked Mary. "No, it's not," answered Mrs. Medlock. "It isn't the sea, and it isn't fields. No, is it mountains? It's just miles and miles of land where nothing grows except rough grass." "It sounds like the sea now," said Mary. "That's because of the wind," said Mrs. Medlock. "It's a sad place, I think, but some people like it. It's very pretty in the spring when the flowers are out." On and on they drove through the darkness. The road went up and down, and Mary felt that the journey would never end. "I don't like it," she said. "I don't like it." At last they stopped in front of a long, low house. Mary could see only one light in the whole house. Inside they found herself in a large, dark room. She looked very small in her black coat, and she felt very small too. Then Mrs. Medlock took her to her room. They walked for a long time. At last Mrs. Medlock said, "Well, here you are. This room and the next one are yours, and you must stay in them. Remember that." And so Mary began her life at Misselthwaite Manor, and she had never felt so cross and alone in her life. She was also rather frightened.